For 20 years, he walked into a shop he built with his own two hands, picked up whatever scrap metal was nearby, and turned it into something that won awards at some of the most competitive car shows in North America. Nobody outside of a small coastal town in Nova Scotia had any idea who he was. His name is Chad Hiltz, and when Discovery Channel cameras finally showed up at his door in 2017, they told the world they'd found a hidden genius. What they didn't tell you is that he'd already been one for 2 decades. By the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly how long Chad Hiltz had been Bad Chad before anyone thought to call him that, and why the version of him that millions fell in love with on television was only ever the surface of what was actually there. He didn't grow up dreaming of television. Chad Hiltz was born on August 31, 1971, in Kingsport, a small seaside village in Kings County, Nova Scotia, Canada, sitting right on the edge of the Minas Basin. His father, Doug Hiltz, ran a White Rose gas station. Not a glamorous start, not a connected family, just a kid watching old cars roll in off the coastal highway while his father topped off their tanks. That turned out to be enough. Cars fascinated Chad from the time he could stand. The curves of a 1940s hood, the sound a flathead engine made when it turned over in the cold. His mother owned a 1946 Dodge, and by the time Chad was 14 years old, he was already driving it to school. Not legally, just because he could, and because nobody in Kingsport was going to stop him. His father shared the obsession. At one point, Chad sold his hockey card collection and convinced his father to buy a 1934 Ford 3-window coupe. The two of them fixed the car together, side by side, in a garage that smelled like gasoline and rust. That car, that moment, is probably the most important thing that ever happened to Chad Hiltz, because it showed him that something broken could be made whole again, that something worthless could become something worth something. But school didn't work out. Chad dropped out. Then he tried a local college to study auto body work and left after getting into a fight with another student. After that, in 1987, he took a job at a grain mill. He was 16 years old, already a father, and already out of options. He was also already fired. The grain mill was the first job he lost. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next several years, Chad Hiltz was fired from every single position he ever held. The grain mill, a chicken processing plant, and a string of other jobs that didn't require a diploma, but still managed to decide that Chad Hiltz wasn't the right fit. He said it himself, years later, in a rare candid moment. He told a reporter from Saltwire that he finally figured out he'd better do something he was actually good at, because what he was doing wasn't working, for him or for anyone else. And here's the part most fans never ask about. What came next wasn't a phone call from a television producer. It wasn't an offer or an opportunity. What came next was silence. Chad Hiltz, broke and repeatedly fired at 16, looked at the one thing in his life that had never let him down and decided to bet everything on it. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. The version of Chad Hiltz that the world met on Discovery Channel in January 2019 was presented as a discovery, an unknown talent, a rough-edged guy from the backwoods of Nova Scotia who'd somehow figured out how to build cars that look like nothing else on Earth. That framing wasn't a lie, exactly. It just left out the 2 decades that came before. After the jobs fell away and the direction became clear, Chad Hiltz moved to Canning, Nova Scotia, and built a shop. Not rented one, not leased a unit in an industrial park. He constructed the building himself, with his own hands, on a property outside of town, and started doing the only thing that had ever felt natural to him, taking things that other people had given up on and making them into something nobody expected. He called the shop Green Goblin Customs, named after one of his earliest signature builds, a 1962 Chrysler 4-door that he'd stripped down and rebuilt into something that barely resembled its original form. The Green Goblin had no doors. Its engine sat in the back. The trunk was positioned in the middle, between the engine and the 2 seats. The car drove in the direction you'd least expect. It was bizarre, it was original, and it won awards. That was the thing nobody who watched the TV show ever fully grasped. Chad wasn't learning his craft on camera. He'd already mastered it, alone, years before anyone was watching. He had a mentor by that point. Gene Winfield, a legendary figure in American custom car culture, took notice of what Chad was doing and worked with him. Winfield has been building and painting custom cars since the 1950s, and his involvement with Chad wasn't promotional or ceremonial. He actually painted one of Chad's most celebrated builds, leaving behind his signature fade finish on a car called Cruella de Vil, a creation Chad and a colleague had constructed from 16 flat sheets of metal, starting from scratch. When Winfield puts his name on your work, the custom car world pays attention, and the world of competitive car shows paid attention too. Long before a single camera crew arrived in Nova Scotia, Chad Hiltz had won 3 awards at the World of Wheels, the prestigious international car show held in Boston. He'd also taken 4 awards at the Castrol Radical Speed Sports Show in Moncton. He'd earned the Master Builder Award. He'd won first place for Radical Custom. His shop wasn't just operational, it was producing award-winning work. And if that weren't enough, in 1998, while Colton was still an infant and Chad was still unknown outside of a 50-mile radius, he launched Rockabilly Weekend, an annual car event on his own property. Live music, tattoo artists, dancing, custom cars from across the region pulling into the lot. He'd been running that event for 20 years by the time Discovery Channel came calling. But there's something underneath all of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it changes how you understand everything else. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. What Chad Hiltz built in that shop was remarkable. What he lived through to get there is something else entirely. By the time he was building award-winning cars and hosting regional car festivals, Chad had already been married and divorced more than once, fathered 3 children across 3 separate relationships, and raised a family in circumstances that he's spoken about publicly only in the vaguest terms. He became a father at 16. The identity of his first partner has never been confirmed publicly. Chad has consistently declined to discuss her, but the facts are documented. He left school to support that child, took the grain mill job, and started a life that most teenagers wouldn't know how to navigate. The relationship didn't last. By the time he was 27, Chad had remarried. His son Colton was born on August 10, 1998. That relationship ended not long after Colton's birth, which meant Chad was building Green Goblin Customs, hosting Rockabilly Weekend, winning competitions, creating the foundation of everything that would eventually make him famous, as a single father operating in the aftermath of 2 failed marriages before he turned 30. Then, in 1999, he met a woman named Mandy Mosher. The two stayed together for years, and on August 15, 2004, they welcomed a daughter named Harley. That relationship ended too. Chad relocated to Canning with what remained of his life and kept building cars. 3 relationships, 3 children. By the time Harley was born, Chad Hiltz had already lived through more personal disruption than most people encounter across an entire adult life. He has never made a spectacle of any of it. He doesn't tell those stories in interviews. He deflects. He redirects. He has said, in his own words, that he respects the past and looks to the future. What he doesn't say, and what the television show was never going to say, is that every one of those scars existed before the cameras arrived. The guy Discovery Channel introduced to the world as a lovable eccentric with a gift for scrap metal had been carrying those decades of private history for years before anyone outside Nova Scotia knew his name. Colton eventually came to work at the shop. Their relationship, as seen on the show, was complicated. Direct at times, difficult at others, but it was real. Colton acknowledged on screen that he hadn't spent much time with his father growing up. That wasn't a scripted moment. That was the weight of everything Chad had been quietly carrying. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. Jolene McIntyre met Chad Hiltz at his own event. She'd been working at a pool hall in New Minas when someone came in and asked her to put up a poster for the Rockabilly Weekend car show. She went to the show. She met Chad. She was in her late 20s. He was in his mid-40s. She had a commerce degree from St. Mary's University in Halifax. He had a shop full of scrap metal and a reputation that was entirely local. By November 2016, they were together. And almost immediately, Jolene understood something that Chad had never bothered to figure out. The work was remarkable, but nobody outside of Nova Scotia knew it existed. She asked him a question, early on in the relationship, that he's referenced in interviews. What would she want if she could have any car in the world? Her answer was a Bugatti, specifically the Type 57 SC Atlantic that Ralph Lauren had purchased and that Forbes had estimated to be worth $40 million. Exotic, elegant, completely unlike anything you'd expect to find coming out of a backyard shop in rural Canada. Chad said he'd build it for her. That answer is what changed everything. Not the build itself, as extraordinary as it was, but what Jolene did next. She was a commerce graduate with an eye for opportunity, and she recognized that a man building a scratch-built replica of one of the rarest cars in the world, using basic tools in a hand-constructed shop, was a story that could reach beyond the Kings County car show circuit. She started documenting it. Weekly video updates, detailed posts tracking every stage of the build. She spent an entire year investing her own time promoting what Chad was doing. And within months, the videos were attracting thousands of viewers who had never heard of Canning, Nova Scotia, or Green Goblin Customs. Discovery Channel executives saw the footage. They reached out. Within less than a year of Jolene's first social media posts, Chad Hiltz had a television deal. The man who had been fired from every job he'd ever held, who had been building cars alone in a rural shop for 2 decades, who had been running his own annual car festival since 1998. That man went from invisible to a Discovery Channel premiere on January 1, 2019. The show was called Bad Chad Customs. It ran on Monday nights at 10 p.m., 6 episodes in the first season. It brought in an audience that had no idea any of this history existed. But here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. Bad Chad Customs was a hit. That part is not in dispute. Viewers loved the builds, the Pinto turned Euro Roadster, the Oldsmobile converted into a functioning dump truck, the open-wheel race car assembled under deadline pressure. They loved the team dynamics. They loved the relationship between Chad and Colton playing out on screen, imperfect and real. They loved the way Chad could walk into a junkyard, spot a piece of sheet metal no one else would touch, and describe exactly what he was going to turn it into. What they didn't know, because nobody told them, was that the version of Chad Hiltz they were watching had been edited, shaped, and structured by a television production formula. Jolene confirmed this directly. In 2023, speaking on a Facebook Live session, she addressed questions about the show's future and what the experience had actually been like. She acknowledged publicly that portions of Bad Chad Customs had been staged for television, that the format of reality shows is calculated by design, that the freedom she and Chad had experienced making YouTube content was fundamentally different from what television had allowed them to do. This wasn't a headline-grabbing accusation. It was a measured, almost matter-of-fact admission by someone who had been inside the process. And it landed with a weight that the fan community felt, because it confirmed what some viewers had always suspected. The show was built around a real talent, but the version of that talent that aired on Discovery was a curated one. The actual builds were real. Chad worked with a real budget, under real deadline pressure, with real results. The cars that appeared on the show were genuine. But the moments in between, the conversations, the conflicts, the beats that made the show feel spontaneous, were constructed with the same care that television production applies to everything. What that means is that the 20 years of actual unscripted life that preceded the cameras, the marriages, the job losses, the children, the awards nobody saw, the shop he built with his own hands, never made it into the version of Chad Hiltz that most people encountered. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What he did instead is the part nobody talks about. Season 2 of Bad Chad Customs premiered on August 17, 2020. It ran until October 5, 2020, and then it stopped. No formal cancellation announcement came. Discovery Channel stayed quiet. Chad and Jolene didn't address it directly for a significant period of time. The fan base, which had grown substantially during the show's run, began asking questions that went unanswered through 2021 and into 2022. The absence was conspicuous. Shows with Bad Chad's audience engagement typically get renewed, or at least receive an official statement. The silence suggested something had shifted, in the network's priorities, in the production dynamics, or somewhere in the relationship between the people involved. What eventually became clear, through a combination of public statements and observable changes in their social media presence, was that Chad and Jolene had redirected toward YouTube. The official Bad Chad channel, which had existed alongside the TV show, began receiving more consistent content. Builds, travel, the texture of the shop without a production company's fingerprints on it. Jolene had described the difference herself. YouTube gave them creative freedom that television never had. They were their own bosses. The content reflected what was actually happening, not a version of it shaped for a broadcast slot. But the partnership, both professional and personal, didn't hold. Jolene McIntyre's departure from Bad Chad's business and life has become one of the most searched questions in the Bad Chad community over the past 2 years. She was, in every measurable sense, the architect of his public fame. She identified the opportunity. She built the social media presence. She negotiated with Discovery. She managed the shop. She appeared on camera. She was co-founder of Hiltz Auto Co. in every functional sense. And then, at some point after the show ended, she wasn't anymore. Chad has been cautious in public statements about the split. Jolene has spoken more openly, though the full picture has emerged in pieces rather than all at once. What is confirmed is that by the time most fans started asking questions about where Jolene had gone, she had already been gone for a significant period. One phone call, one conversation, that's all it took to change the direction of everything. Before the cameras, before Jolene, before any of it. There is a car called Royal Respect. Chad built it as part of his pre-television work, and it represents something important about who he was in the years the world missed. The build came together under pressure, a deadline that the crew was uncertain they could meet, and Chad delivered. He unveiled it at the Atlantic Nationals. His mentor Gene Winfield was in attendance, not as a courtesy, as an audience member who showed up because he respected what Chad was doing. Winfield examined the car and praised it directly, specifically noting how different it was from every other vehicle at the event. A car enthusiast at the show purchased Royal Respect for $48,000. Chad and his team had put approximately $17,000 into the build. That's not a television result. That's not a Discovery Channel storyline. That's a man operating at the top of his craft in complete obscurity, selling his work at a profit that any business would consider meaningful, years before anyone outside of Nova Scotia ever heard his name. The doorknobs on the Bat Out of Hell, another pre-fame build, came from kitchen cabinets. The dorsal fin was fabricated by hand. Parts were sourced from airplanes, boats, and old lockers. Chad's philosophy, that nothing should be wasted, that every object holds a potential purpose, wasn't a television hook. It was how he had survived financially for 2 decades in a shop with no national profile. He won 3 awards at the World of Wheels in Boston operating that way. 4 more at Castrol Radical Speed Sports in Moncton, the Master Builder Award, first place for Radical Custom. When Discovery Channel described him as an unknown genius, they were right about the genius. They were just 20 years late with the discovery. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. The shop is still running. Chad Hiltz continues to operate out of Canning, Nova Scotia, now under the Hiltz Auto Co. name. The rebranding was made necessary when Marvel Comics, which owns the Green Goblin trademark, raised licensing concerns. The Green Goblin name had to go. The work stayed the same. His YouTube channel carries the builds. He's been posting content through 2024 and into the present, sharing the work without the scaffolding of a television format around it. The audience that found him through Discovery Channel has largely stayed. Some have discovered him through YouTube directly, without ever having seen the TV show. Son Colton remains in the orbit of the shop, continuing the apprenticeship that played out on screen. Daughter Harley, who went on to compete in boxing and reportedly won a local competition in 2017, has been featured on social media by Colton and exists at the edge of the family's public profile. Chad's relationship with his children, complicated by the years of distance that his early adult life created, has been something he's rebuilt quietly, without making it a storyline. The Bugatti, the build that started everything, remains unfinished. It became the through line of the show's 2 seasons, with Jolene describing it at one point as their potential wedding car. The wedding never happened. The car remains a work in progress, sitting in the shop where a television crew spent 2 years filming a version of a story that was never quite the full one. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. What you saw on Bad Chad Customs was real. The talent was real, the builds were real, the pressure was real. But the Chad Hiltz who existed before the show, the one who got fired from every job he tried, who became a father at 16, who built his own shop by hand and won national awards with nobody watching, who ran a car festival for 2 decades before anyone outside Kings County knew his name, that Chad Hiltz was never on television. He was always there. He just wasn't on camera yet. 20 years of invisible work produced the person the world decided to call an overnight success. Chad Hiltz is still in that shop in Canning, still building, still sourcing parts from boats and lockers and places nobody else would think to look, still hosting his event on the property he chose because he thought the land would eventually support a car show, which it did, just not the kind he expected. The television chapter closed. The relationship that opened it ended. The business survived both. What comes next for Chad Hiltz is, by all available evidence, exactly what came before Discovery Channel found him. The work, the builds, the quiet accumulation of craft in a small shop on the eastern edge of Canada, where a man who couldn't hold down a single conventional job turned out to be better at the unconventional ones than almost anyone alive. The real question this story leaves you with isn't about what happened after the cameras arrived. It's about what it means that 20 years of that kind of dedication was invisible until a 20-something woman with a commerce degree started posting videos on social media. Do you think Chad Hiltz ever needed the television show? Or was the work always going to speak for itself, with or without the Discovery Channel?